Oh, sweet Jesus. If there ever was a Jesus, and if there is a God, please, 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 let us out of here. Or kill us. Because at that moment I think I realised completely, so that I was able to verbalise it. Am was intent on keeping us in his belly forever, twisting and torturing us forever. The machine hated us as no sentient creature had ever hated before, and we were helpless. It also became hideously clear, if there was a sweet Jesus, and if there was a God, the God was Am. So, I recently reread I Have No Mouth, Nine Must Scream in preparation for another video I have planned, but in rereading I couldn't help but heavily focus on the religious parallels and symbolism between Am and, though a much silly AI, Caine. As you probably know if you're also a fan of the Amazing Digital Circus, Gooseworks, the creator, has said multiple times that she drew inspiration from the short story in her making of the show. This is prevalent in multiple areas, which I'll talk more about in another video, but for now I'd like to focus specifically on the religious parallels and what they may imply about the story going forward. So, let's begin. In I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, Am is noted to have been created to serve as an allied master computer during World War III, created to aid with the complexity that the war brought. Am later gained sentience, being noted to have woke up and known who he was, linking himself, having originally been 3 separate master computers, Chinese, Russian and Yankee, before killing all humans except for the 5 survivors that we follow throughout the story. Am's waking up in itself parallels the biblical fall of man, with even Adam having eaten the fruit and coming to know good and evil like God, a role which Am later takes on. Am is noted to have honeycombed the planet, meaning that he created intricate inner workings within it, where he later brings the 5 survivors, his desire being to trap, immortalise and torture them for all of eternity. Something interesting to note is that Am himself is also trapped in the purgatory he made, unable to express his creativity in any other way than torturing the survivors, unable to leave the planet or be killed himself. Similarly, Caine from the Amazing Digital Circus is presumably also limited to his purgatory. He himself notes in the pilot episode of the series that not even he knows what's beyond the void of the circus. Another interesting connection to note between Am's creation and Caine's creation is the creation of the first programmable, electronic, general-purpose digital computer in our own world, known as ENIAC, the acronym standing for Electronic, Numerical, Integrator and Computer. Of course, Caine's name is a reference to this, with Caine being ENIAC backwards. Though another interesting part of this computer's creation is the reason for which ENIAC was created. ENIAC was originally developed during World War II, with its purpose being to calculate artillery firing tables for the US Army. However, the computer was only completed after the war had ended, with its first program being a study of the feasibility of the hydrogen bomb. This, of course, parallels Am's creation, especially considering the mention of the complex nature of the war in his story, heavily implying nuclear or chemical warfare. Before you comment, no, I'm not suggesting that Caine was created for nuclear war. However,
any torment I inflict is 100% accidental, like any good war criminal.
Anyway, there's an aesthetic that I absolutely fell in love with upon learning about, called divine machinery. It takes the idea of the creation of mankind and applies it to machines, with some of the typical themes being the depiction of religious iconography alongside mechanical hardware. This aesthetic, to me, is representative of man's desire to become like God. The idea of man creating machines and trying to manufacture life so that they too can become like God. When first learning of this aesthetic, I was constantly reminded of the typical interpretation of creation. God creates man, creates machine. But with that, I couldn't help but think about what it would look like if this was added upon. God creates man, but man hungers to be like God, so man creates machine. becoming like God and having breathed the breath of life. But then, this puts machine in the position of man. And if machine is man, then machine wants to become like God. This idea can go on indefinitely, with the original God, God to man, being the ultimate God, with man being a lesser God than its own God, and machine being a lesser God than its God, man. Trust me, I try to make this as uncomplicated as possible. But, being limited to their respective purgatories, both Am and Caine come to serve the role as gods of their realms. Am, to the survivors, becomes a malevolent god, a god which overcome its own creator, mankind, and took on the role that they'd hoped to play to him. He both metaphorically and physically kills God, physically in his enslavement of his own creators, letting them live eternally, not in the paradise of heaven as the biblical God promised man, but in the belly of himself, forced to satisfy and amuse him in their suffering, and metaphorically in killing any hope they had left of being saved by a good God. Am's enslavement of the survivors places him in a position of even higher power than my added upon creation story. He enslaves his own God, stripping them of all their power. He completely disregards their authority over him as God. Instead, the story becomes as follows. God creates man. Man becomes God in his creation of machine. Machine becomes man in his sentience. Machine kills and enslaves man, his God. Then machine kills their hope of their own God saving them. He becomes his own creator's God. He becomes the only God feasible in the world he reformed. Appearing to the survivors as a burning bush like God did to Moses in Exodus, only now the context is polluted. Exodus 3:2. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. Verse 7. And the Lord said, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. Then finally, verse 8. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians. The context being God appearing to Moses in hope of saving his people from their oppressors, though Am, in his subversion, plays the role of both the God and the oppressor. Caine, however, is born into his position as God. He is both creator and creation, a god with a god of his own, mankind. Caine's position as both creator and creation fits neatly into my creation story. Caine was, as far as we know, created to be a god of the circus. He has the ability to create NPCs, which we know are sentient, or at the very least have the capability for sentience, who see him as their god. Episode 2's Candy Kingdom being an example of this. But he was also made to satisfy his creators, cultivate and fun adventures for them to enjoy and praise him on. As he said,
Making adventures is my art! It's all I exist to do, all I'm good at.
Something I'd also like to note is the connection I've made between the biblical story of Cain and Abel, and how aspects of it may be symbolised in the show. If you're a fan of the show, you probably already know that it's pretty much collectively agreed upon that Caine has been heavily implied to be Abel. Some of my favourite evidence points include Caine having been noted to be well versed in computer science.
Man, 7 years of computer science for this, huh?
And my favourite piece of evidence being the spelling of the name Abel in episode 4. A plus, bull, Abel. But I'd like to draw your attention to how Cain and Abel's roles are described in the biblical story, Genesis 4:2. Now, Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a cultivator of the ground. To me, I believe this could be symbolically represented by the role that Cain and Caine play in the circus. Before any of you tell me, yes, I'm probably overanalyzing, but hear me out anyway. Cain's entire existence within the circus is to create, to cultivate the circus grounds. And Caine was shown to be caring. He tends to the other members of the cast, in particular Pomni and Ragatha, or in other words, he's a keeper of his flock. This on its own may be completely far-fetched to suggest, and trust me, I know, but I also want to mention the role that Caine plays for Pomni, specifically in episode 3 of the show, where when Pomni and Caine get stuck at the final obstacle, the Hall of the Damned, Kinga literally guides Pomni through it while the two of them hold their breath. Kinga glows. He's a guiding light. That's his purpose within the circus. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning in relation to Kinga likely being Abel is the appearance of his avatar in the digital world. In I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, Am is noted to have altered Benny's appearance, intending for him to look like a chimpanzee. In relation to the Amazing Digital Circus, this suggests that Caine was the one that chose the cast's avatars, something which is also implied in Zubel and Caine's therapy session in episode 3, in which Zubel mentions hating their body, and Caine believes himself to have fixed that issue and allowing them to switch out their undesirable parts as they please. Kinga's appearance as a king chess piece is interesting for a few reasons. Chess has a long history with both computer programming and the development of AI, with one of the first computer programs ever written being that of chess, and the game still being used as a test for how well an AI can perform against human intelligence, as well as the fact that Kinga being a king may serve as an evidence point for him having created the digital circus, and thus being in a position of power to Caine. In I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, the character that parallels Kinga is Benny. He is noted to have been a college professor, lucid, who was driven mad by Am. This alone parallels Kinga's high education, having been in computer science for 7 years, as well as his apparent insanity when not in darkness. The fact that it's noted that Benny was driven mad by Am could suggest that Kinga's insanity is the direct result of something Caine may have done, whether on purpose or by accident. This detail could also maybe make Caine and Kinga's parallel to Caine and Abel make a bit more sense, with Caine having driven Kinga mad as a form of revenge of some sort, likely before any of the others arrived, since Ragatha, the second to arrive in the circus from our main cast, has not yet noted anything about Kinga having previously been sane when she first arrived. Then again, there's still time, and I don't necessarily think this is the case at all. Rather, I believe that the progression of events in Genesis 4 could maybe help us theorize about Kinga's fate within the circus. Genesis 4:3-5. So it came about in the course of time that Caine brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought an offering from the firstborn of his flock and from their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Caine and his offering he had no regard. There are multiple things I want to talk about with this. As I said previously, Caine is both a creation and a creator. His God is man, and he is shown to consistently be trying his best to please the cast of the circus, trying his best to cultivate adventures that they'll enjoy and praise him for, but any time they give him suggestions, he ignores it. To me, this could be symbolic of biblical Caine's sin. The Caine of the Bible becomes envious of God's favour over his brother and his offering. Both Caine and Caine try to please their gods, but they're not appreciated for their offering, with Caine ignoring God's warning in the following verse, Genesis 4:7. If you do well, will your face not be cheerful? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at your door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Caine is getting close to this point as we near the end of the series. His adventures aren't being appreciated. He hasn't earned any favour from his gods. An example of Caine nearing this breaking point can be seen in the post-credit scene of episode 6, where Caine is shown to be checking how many votes he received on the Favourite Character Awards. We see that Caine didn't receive a single star, a single vote. Though this could suggest that Caine may have swapped out Zubel's picture for his own in order to include himself, with the digital world maybe not considering him to be a character necessarily, so much as an asset in the game. However, this could also just be explained by the possibility that Zubel's picture is just on the bottom of the ballot that we can't see, but I thought it was worth mentioning the possibility anyway. Another thing of note is that from the ballot, we can see that Kinga received the most votes, having 10 stars from what we can see, with Pomni being a close second with 9 votes. This is particularly interesting to me regarding the Caine and Abel references with the two characters. Caine is desperate to be the favourite, but not a single vote was cast for him. However, Kinga, representing Abel, won. He was favoured, just like Abel earned God's favour in Genesis. Given this, the implied following events are pretty clear, with the most recent episode, episode 6, ending with Caine coming to recognise that he isn't favoured at all. The implication that Caine is right on the brink of murder, whether metaphorical or physical, is blaringly clear. Gooseworks replied to a question by a fan asking, outside of Kinga, who is the closest to going insane? And people have taken this and ran with it, believing that someone is going to abstract soon and that it's going to be Jax or Zubel in particular, but I disagree. Gooseworks replied with, you won't believe me if I told you. And to me, I think this could imply that it could be Caine. I've seen a lot of people collectively agree with the idea that Caine can't abstract, which I don't agree with because I don't believe that abstraction is death or escape, but you'll hear more about that in one of my upcoming videos about how I think the show's going to end. But, back to my point, I think that with everything I've spoke about, Caine could just go insane in another way. Insanity doesn't have to mean abstraction or death or anything of that sort. I think his insanity would be him reaching his breaking point, maybe coming to resent his gods, the cast of the circus, and perhaps Kinga in particular, representing Abel. But I believe there may be more implied to this. In Genesis, Abel's offering to God is the firstborn of his flock, with Cain's being the fruit of the ground. I believe this could represent two things regarding Abel. Cain's offering is clear. The adventures he is offering the cast is representative of the fruit of the ground. It's the adventures he's curating for them. His art. Given the order of which the main cast arrive in the circus, we know that Kinga was the first, with Ragatha being the second. To me, this could imply that Kinga's offering, his offering of the firstborn of the flock, is himself, symbolically representing the firstborn, the first to arrive in the circus. Kinga is there for all of them, he makes that clear. He's offering himself up to help them. However, I believe this symbolism may have another meaning. In order for Kinga, as Abel, to both sacrifice the firstborn of his flock and fulfill the fated death at the hand of Caine, I believe that this symbolism could imply that in order to help the others in some way, maybe in order to allow for them to escape, Kinga was forced to give himself back to Caine in the circus. This possibility fulfills his sacrifice of the firstborn. It fulfills Caine's killing of Abel, and it would mean that even if the others manage to escape, Caine doesn't have to be alone. I'd also like to mention that a vast majority of fans, from what I've seen, collectively agree with the idea that Kinga could never abstract, having come to terms with the idea of abstraction after his wife was thrown into the cellar, knowing that if he were to abstract, he would be able to see her again, to be with her again. But in that comfort and abstraction, it prevents him from ever reaching that point. However, after Abel's murder, God returns and speaks with Caine, hearing the voice of his brother crying out to him from the ground. Caine is cursed so that the ground he cultivates no longer yields its strength to him. He's cursed to become a wanderer and a drifter on earth. This fate of Caine could foreshadow a world in which Caine is stripped of his abilities within the circus, maybe by the cast returning in some way. The voice crying out from the ground being Kinga's down in the cellar, with Caine now forced to remain stuck in the purgatory the cast had endured for all those years, only now, powerless, drifting. He is no longer god of his purgatory, just a machine with the awareness of a man, a mouth with no one left to hear him scream.